So next up on the project is we got to do the harmonic balancer. So this here is the OEM balancer. This has about 30,000 miles on it, a little over that, and it's 16 years old. The car is a 2009, so this is the original balancer. This one was not wobbling, didn't show any signs of failures or anything, but when I pulled it off and inspected it, I noticed on the back side here some of this rubber was starting to crack between the inner hub and kind of the outer inertia ring, I guess you would call it, and it was starting to break down in here, so likely this didn't have too much life left in it. So if you notice right in here, you could see that crack right between the rubber. So this is the metal ring here, and this is also metal, so the rubber right in between, you could see it's all cracking. So this inner hub was likely ready to kind of shear and separate off this outer hub. Alright, so here's what you get. You get a box, you get some cool stickers, you get the hub, you get the balancer, and you get some hardware and a nice instruction booklet here that breaks down all the procedures on how to put this together and then put this thing on the car. Okay, so this one came basically pre-assembled. You see some of them here in the diagram. They show the outer shell, the inertia weight, and then the hub as, you know, separate components, or even this one that has another shell. I've seen some videos online too where the accessory drive pulley is like another piece that gets sandwiched between the hub. So I don't know if they've made some changes over the years and they've just sent it this way now. That's easier for the end user, the customer, to just put the hub this in, torque it down, and be done. So it seems to be pretty good. Looks like you have a little punch mark there, like a center punch mark just above that hole. And then you'll see here on the hub also, or on the balancer, there's another center punch mark. So these two would line up, and you can see the way the bolts are indexed. So you have groups of 3, and then you'd basically have 9 bolts. It even mentions it here, 9 bolts. So 3, 6, and then 9. So we'll put these two together, and then they give you the hardware. It looks like it already has Loctite on here, but we'll probably just put a little extra blue 242 so nothing comes apart. It is also mentioned in here when you're doing the assembly to use Loctite 242. Alright, so we're going to put the hub in, taking note to where our punch marks are so we can line those up properly in the hub. This thing has a super tight fit. There we go. It's definitely machined with a very tight tolerance. So now we should be able to just flip this over and get our bolt started. Alright, so now we're done with that. The next critical part here is using the proper socket when you tighten these fasteners. So they require a Torx Plus 40, not a regular Torx bit, so there is a difference. I'll try to see if I can show you guys here, but you'll see the regular Torx on the right basically has a pointy end to the star, and the one on my left is kind of more rounded over, flat on the peaks. So you definitely want to ensure you get yourself a TP40 Torx Plus, like this one here, TP40, to ensure that you're not going to round out this hardware and damage them and get them stuck in there. Alright, so we'll put this thing flat down on the bench and run all these in nice and even, and then we'll get to torquing. Alright, next thing we're going to do is torque the fasteners down. So an easy way to hold it to counter the force of the torque wrench is you could take your old accessory drive belt, like the AC belt or even the serpentine belt, put it on there, you slip the box end of the wrench through it, basically cinch it up and then fold the wrench over, and then now you have a way to counter the torque wrench when you're turning. Alright, so we got the torque wrench set up at 16 foot-pounds, and we're just going to go one by one across this and get it torqued. Alright, last thing we got to do to complete this assembly and before we install it on the car is you'll see here on this step 2, obviously if you have these instructions at home you can just read them, but it talks about a thin friction washer behind the damper hub in front of the first oil pump gear, and the washer should be left in place and will not hurt anything if you are not planning to pin or keying your crankshaft. So we're not doing that, we're not going boosted, so this thing we're basically going to transfer over from the old one. You can see it just kind of pops itself off. It's a thin little friction washer, so that side's going to go against the oil pump or the crank, and it's got like a little rubber kind of lip on it. We'll just put that right onto here. Alright, next thing we want to talk about quick before we install it on the car. For this build we're doing, well, I had already in there the upgraded ARP bolt. You can use the factory bolt if you want, just make sure it's new. Don't reuse your old bolt because it's a torque to yield, so it's one-time use. You'll see that in directions also, but we already have the upgraded ARP bolt, so we can reuse that. You're going to want to make sure that you get yourself a install tool. So basically what this does is you thread this into the crankshaft, the snout, and then you're going to put the balancer on, or maybe you have the balancer just started on, thread this in, and then you're going to basically walk the balancer on by turning this nut. This also has a bearing in it, so you can see. So when you have the damper on the crank and you have this in it, while you're turning this nut, the bearing is rotating instead of scoring the crap out of the inside of the balancer hub here. And then you're also not driving this and using these threads in the crankshaft to basically pull the balancer in, which could damage the internal threads in the crank. So make sure you go out and splurge, spend the $30 for the install kit, and you'll save your crank and the front of your balancer. And the last thing I got to do, if you're just doing the balancer, you might not be doing this step, but I have a new GM front seal. So I got to pull the alignment tool out now out of the front, and then we can install the new seal. Alright, next up we got the front seal. I'm going to see if I can use my alignment tool to push this in. If not, I do have a socket that basically matches the OD of the ring. It's just under, so it won't hit the timing cover. It's a 2-inch impact socket. So let's try this out. Fortunately, got a bunch of crap in the way with the rack and the wire harness, so let's see what we can do here. All right, I think the camera cut off, but we got the seal seated using the timing cover centering tool, so that worked pretty well. Anti-seize is recommended from ATI to put on the crank when you draw the balancer on. So I just have here some of this Molykote metal assembly paste. This will kind of work in the same manner. The anti-seize, it just will give it a little better coefficient of friction between the crank and the pulley and not score or damage the crank or anything when it gets drawn on. Just take a little dab on the finger here and put that on the crank. All right, next we're gonna put the balancer on. All right, so we just got that slid on there. Next we're gonna put the rod on. Then we'll slip this thing in. And then we have our nut with our bearing. Okay, next is to make sure the hub is seated properly. They give you this section in the book, but it's not really useful because I think these have so many applications. The instructions are just generic. So it talks about checking essentially the distance between the end of the crank snout and then the balancer. So you'd have to have the original measurement of the hub, the part of the snout that's sticking out, and then you subtract those two and get your difference here. But they don't give you a tolerance or a clearance, so there's no really way for you to know whether you're within spec or out of spec if it's fully seated or not. So this is kind of useless in a way. If you look at the factory balancer installation instructions, so this section here, and then they actually give you a tolerance here. So you need to be 2.4 to 4.48 millimeters between the crank snout and the beginning of the balancer, and that tells you it's fully seated. But this is obviously for an OEM balancer, not for the ATI, so we don't really have a reference for that. So the best thing we just kind of do is to get the balancer fully seated, which we did, and then check that our AC belt pulley lines up with the idler. And you could kind of tell, like visually looking at it, if the two are lined up. You could even take a straight edge if you wanted to. But you could kind of feel once that balancer seats and it's made it home. And as long as it visually looks like it's lined up, I think we're going to be okay. So next we got torquing our bolt down. So as I mentioned before, we got the ARP bolt here. This has a very thick washer on it. I'm a little conflicted also on the instructions they give you here. So here's your GM factory bolt installation procedure. We're down here with the ATI. So it talks about applying high temp RTV to both sides of the washer. So basically here and on the back side of the washer, and then using 262 red Loctite. But if you read the instructions, when they give you this bolt for installing it, they want you to use their ARP anti-seize compound on the threads, and then also essentially between the washer and the bolt. And in my experience, I'm going to stick with ARP's recommendation. The reason being is when you're torquing a bolt down, essentially this bolt isn't moving, it's not walking with the thread. So what's happening is the bolt is being torqued against something, you're turning the bolt, so these threads are all basically moving in an axial direction. So that's in turn stretching this bolt and what provides the tension to hold everything together. So if you don't put the anti-seize on here and put it under this washer, essentially what happens is you create more friction when this bolt is turning, and it's going to click on the torque wrench before you've actually stretched the bolt enough to get the proper torque or the proper tension on it. Same thing under the washer. When you put your anti-seize under here, what you're essentially doing is lowering that coefficient of friction between these two, so the washer would stay stationary. You'd be rotating the bolt head and it'd have less friction here, so it's able to basically stretch more before your torque wrench clicks and says, okay, you're at 250 foot-pounds or whatever that number is. So having the proper assembly paste or moly paste or whatever you want to call it on the threads, it could be oil, it could be dry, it could be assembly paste, is very critical to having the proper torque applied to the bolt and the proper stretch. So if you just put Loctite on here and then put RTV between here and here, that bolt is essentially going to click on the torque wrench a lot sooner because the friction between the threads here is higher, and then this bolt actually isn't going to have the proper stretch and the proper tension under it. So I kind of have to disagree with the way this is written up for ATI. Maybe their concern is this bolt backing out, but again, if you put the proper tension on this bolt, then it's not going to come out. I mean, I've had this bolt in for 10 or 15,000 miles since this car was last apart, and the bolt didn't come out. Put the proper lube on it, torqued it the proper way, and it was tight. So we're going to go ahead, put the lubrication on the threads and underneath the washer here, and we're going to go ahead and get this bolt torqued down. All right, we got our torque wrench set to 230 foot-pounds. And I've got the car in 6th gear, wheels on the ground, so that should be able to basically hold the drive line instead of having to put in a tool into the flywheel. So we'll see if we can get it done. Alright guys, that's a wrap on the ATI installation. We'll pick up in the next video, keep building up the front end of the motor, and we'll get ready to get the heads back from the machine shop. So I'll see you on the next one.